The brutal murder of an Afghan former journalist has sparked outrage from women rights activists. Mina Mangal was a well-known TV reporter in Kabul. She also worked for the Afghan government before being shot and killed in broad daylight in Kabul earlier this month. Mangal's family has reportedly blamed her abusive husband from a forced marriage.
Her murder highlights the struggles of many Afghan women who face domestic violence without justice, and it's seen by activists as an example of what's to come if the Taliban is allowed to return. The former regime has been engaged in peace talks with the U.S. So CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata is following the story from London. So Charlie, a lot of people are not going to know Mina's story, but it's been reported that she posted about threats online just days before her death. What more do we know about her and her murder?
Well, you know, Mina was a high-profile individual in Kabul. She was very well known, a television presenter and a government advisor. So I think the first initial thought was that she was gunned down because of her views and because she was so high-profile in broad daylight in Kabul. But as it transpires, as you pointed out, she had posted online that she was in the middle of this abusive marriage. She had warned several times, warned her family that she was worried about her own life, which is why her mother specifically is convinced that her husband is to blame for this execution. She says in the past her husband and his relatives had abducted her and beaten her. And where this has drawn so much attention at a larger scale, it talks about domestic abuse in Afghanistan, which is out of control. Recent UN report said that 50% of the women in Afghanistan are reporting cases of domestic abuse. That's a UN report, which is a staggering number, 35% around the world, which is bad enough, but it just underlines the sort of culture of domestic abuse in Afghanistan and something that needs to be looked at. And her friends are saying, look, she had given these warnings. Why wasn't she protected? And this is just one example. This is one that we're seeing. How many times is this happening across the country?
You know, Charlie, it's a delicate dance of diplomacy, right? The United States is trying to negotiate with the Taliban, but there are, as you know, a number of Afghan women and advocates that have been speaking out in recent months around those peace talks because they're worried that the United States will not take their rights into account while they're trying to make a deal with the Taliban. And it's a struggle that all countries face, right? You're trying to engage in diplomacy, but you don't like the practices or the laws or the traditions, for example, in a certain country, but you go along with it because you know it's for a greater cause.
It is a very controversial issue, Vlad. Zalmay Khalilzad has been having these talks with the Taliban seven times, in the past 6 months. And they're happening without the Afghan government being part of it. And what many people are worried about is these are essentially secret talks. And the Taliban will have their own demands. And one of those demands will be some sort of semblance of a return to Taliban rule. And there have also already been reports that the Taliban has been imposing the old Taliban of beating women who weren't wearing the burqa and imposing their own law in these Taliban-controlled areas. And I think what's important to point out here, when you talk about the cultural sensitivities, there's acceptable and then there's unacceptable. And the reason women are so concerned that we're winding back the clock, I mean, the past 18 years have been relatively gradual and positive for women relative to what they had before under the Taliban. What they're worried about is this is going to start ebbing away. Well, that's already started happening because the Taliban has already taken control of great parts of Afghanistan, great portions of Afghanistan. And it's worth remembering that the Taliban didn't come out of thin air. They are supported culturally, religiously, by the people in those regions, by the locals in that region, So it may be abhorrent to us in the West and to pretty much any thinking person, but to those local areas, they have support from the locals.
Yeah, you know, Vlad used a number of different words, including tradition. And not that it's ever a tradition, I think, to abuse people, but I think that's a really good point that you brought up, Vlad, and that, you know, we struggle with imposing our own ethical ideals on another culture, but at the same time, sort of wrong is wrong, right? So listen, you know, like you mentioned, you've been in Afghanistan covering this war for years now, right? It's been going on for 17 years.
Long time.
I'm curious about how men and women feel about the prospect of American troops leaving.
Well, people are concerned about security. That is the #1 issue, and it has been the #1 issue for the past 18 years. Before that, I mean, it predated any American involvement. You know, Afghanistan has been at war, some conflict or another, for generations. So that is the #1 concern. They realize that having Americans there does keep, to a certain degree, keeps the Taliban in check, even though, yes, they are losing territory. First and foremost among American forces is force protection themselves. They can't police the entire country. They need the Afghan forces to take care of that. I don't think there's anybody in Afghanistan, including the president, who feels that Afghan forces are up to the job of taking on the Taliban. So that's their #1 concern. In terms of having a U.S. footprint, it really depends on who you talk to. Of course, if you're in the South and you like the fact that the Taliban have control of that area, you don't want to see any more American forces there in any description whatsoever. But even the Taliban are looking at a limited acceptance of U.S. forces in terms of going after international terror groups like ISIS or al-Qaeda. That is one of the sticking points, that there will be a U.S. presence there no matter what happens with the drawdown, because in a weird way, the Taliban and the United States are allies against other, like ISIS, insurgent groups that are now starting to spring up. So that will be one of the conditions of the talks that are going forward. But it is fundamental to point out here, the most controversial things about the talks that are happening between the United States and the Taliban is the fact that the Afghan government itself is shut out from those talks. So imagine the controlling government of your own country not being involved at any level of these talks that are taking place between essentially two warring parties in your own country. So whether the results of those talks are going to be